One quiet evening on the porch broke down the unspoken boundaries between us, altering everything with a single, unforgettable moment. Life has these unexpected shifts, moments that knock you off balance, making you question everything you thought you knew. This trip with Lucas to his family's secluded cabin was meant to be simple, a getaway for two friends to relax in the mountains after the demands of college. But from the moment we arrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would hold more than I'd anticipated. The cabin was a dream surrounded by towering pine trees, a serene lake reflecting the sky, and absolute silence. Lucas's mom, Mrs. Grant, had always been gracious when we met at school events. But here, in her element, she radiated a certain energy I couldn't quite put my finger on. She welcomed us warmly, her laugh rich and inviting as she hugged her son. And then me holding me just a little longer than I'd expected, I brushed it off, chalking it up to the excitement of the trip. After all, this was her sanctuary, and she wanted us to feel at home that night. We all stayed up late talking and laughing by the fire. Lucas shared stories about his wild high school days, and his mom, laughing, would fill in the details he'd conveniently skipped. The firefight flickered across Mrs. Grant's face, casting shadows that highlighted her warm smile and piercing gaze. She seemed completely at ease, enjoying our company and reliving old memories. As the night wore on, Lucas grew sleepy, his eyelids heavy as he stretched out on the couch, eventually drifting off mid-sentence. I stayed a bit longer, feeling somehow drawn to her stories and the comfortable silence that followed. But then she turned her attention to me. "So what about you?" she asked, her voice soft. "What brought you up here? Besides Lucas dragging you along?" I laughed, caught off guard by the question. I needed a break. I guess life's been a lot lately. I admitted, not quite sure why I was opening up to her. There was something in her gaze that felt safe, like she truly wanted to understand. She nodded thoughtfully, a knowing look in her eyes. "Sometimes we all need to escape, don't we?" she murmured almost to herself. There was a beat of silence, a moment where our eyes met and held just a second too long. I could feel something shift, a silent understanding passing between us. It was subtle, something I couldn't quite name, but it left me feeling different. And as I finally said goodnight and headed to bed, I couldn't shake that. Look, her eyes following me down the hall as if she wanted to say more. The next morning, Lucas had planned for us to go hiking, but he was still out cold when I woke up. Mrs. Grant was already in the kitchen sipping her coffee and glancing out the window at the fog that hung low over the trees. She looked up when I entered, her face lighting up with that same warm smile from last night. "Morning," she greeted, gesturing for me to join her. "Lucas sleeps like a rock, doesn't he?" You'd think he'd wake up with the smell of coffee, but no. She laughed softly, her voice filling the quiet kitchen. We chatted for a while, talking about everything from college stress to the peacefulness of the mountains. She told me stories about the cabin, how she and her late husband had built it from the ground up, their summers spent here with Lucas, the traditions they'd started. Her voice was filled with nostalgia, and I could see how much this place meant to her. "Have you tried the sauna yet?" she asked, suddenly changing the subject. I shook my head. "Not yet," Lucas said. "It's one of the best parts of coming here." Her eyes sparkled. "He's right. It's my favorite place to relax." She paused, her gaze flickering to the window. "You know, the sauna's best early in the morning before the day really begins. If you're up for it, I can show you." I hesitated, but the idea was tempting. There was something about the morning, quiet, the stillness of the forest that made it feel like a special experience. I agreed, and she smiled, standing and motioning for me to follow her out the back door. The sauna was nestled between the trees, a small wooden structure with a charm all its own. Inside, it was warm and dimly lit, with benches lining the walls and a simple stone heater in the center. She explained how the sauna worked, her voice soft and soothing as the heat began to rise, filling the room with a gentle warmth that seeped into my bones. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the steam wrapping around us, and I found myself relaxing more than I had in weeks. Mrs. Grant seemed different here, more vulnerable somehow, as if the years had fallen away, leaving only her true self. After a while, she began talking again, her voice barely more than a whisper as she shared memories of her life stories of her late husband and the dreams they'd had for this place. There was a sadness in her eyes, a wistfulness that tugged at something inside me. I wanted to say something to offer comfort, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, I listened, letting her speak, feeling a connection that was both unexpected and undeniable. And then, as she looked at me, her gaze softened, and there was a pause, a moment where time seemed to stand. Still, it was as if she was seeing me in a way no one else ever had, and I felt my pulse quicken caught in her gaze. But before I could say anything, she looked away, breaking the spell as she stood, her voice cheerful again. "Well?" "I think that's enough steam for one morning," she said, her smile playful as she opened the door to let in a rush of cool air. I followed her out, blinking in the brightness of the day, the weight of that moment lingering between us like an unspoken promise. As we walked back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, a shift in the air, a new awareness that simmered beneath the surface. And though I didn't fully understand it yet, I knew one thing for sure. This trip was about to become far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. By the time Lucas finally rolled out of bed that morning, the sun was already high, casting a golden light through the cabin windows. I was back in the kitchen, sipping another cup of coffee and trying to focus on anything but the lingering memories of the sauna. Mrs. Grant was moving around with her usual grace, her expression unreadable, and I kept finding my thoughts wandering back to that moment. That brief second, where something more had lingered between us. I told myself I was reading too much into it, that it was just the steam and early morning haze making things feel more intense. Still, I couldn't deny the energy between us, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it seemed to grow. Lucas was completely oblivious, already planning out our hike and talking a mile a minute about the places he wanted to show me. But my attention kept drifting back to her. As we prepared to head out, she was there at the doorway, smiling at us with that familiar warmth. But when her eyes met mine, there was a flicker, something that went beyond a simple look. It was brief, just a second, but it held the same electricity as the sauna, a silent understanding that seemed to stretch between us like a taut wire. "Be safe out there," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge that I couldn't quite place. Lucas waved her off, promising we'd be back before sundown, and with one last glance, I followed him out, trying to shake the unease settling over me. The hike was exactly what I needed. The fresh mountain air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the sheer beauty of the landscape distracted me, grounding me in the present. Lucas was in his element, pointing out hidden trails and reliving his childhood adventures. We laughed, joked, and for a while I forgot about everything else. But as we reached the peak of the trail and stopped to catch our breath, I found my thoughts drifting back the way Mrs. Grant had looked at me. The unspoken weight of it left a mark I couldn't ignore. And for the first time, I wondered what it meant for me. Was it possible I'd imagined it, or was there something real, something deeper than I dared to admit? "Hey, Lucas," called out, breaking my train of thought. "You good man. You've been a little quiet." Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, forcing a laugh, just taking it all in. I guess he grinned, slapping me on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. This place has a way of getting to you. Doesn't it? All the quiet gives you too much time to think." I nodded, trying to focus on his words, but even as we made our way back down the trail, I could feel the anticipation, building a strange excitement mixed with unease that only grew as the cabin came into view. When we finally returned, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the clearing. Mrs. Grant was outside, sitting on the porch with a book in hand, her face relaxed and peaceful as she looked up at us. Lucas collapsed onto the porch steps, groaning about the hike, and she laughed, tousling his hair affectionately. But when her gaze shifted to me, her expression softened a look that seemed to say so much without saying anything at all. "Glad to see you survived." She teased her smile, hinting at something. "More?" I tried to respond with a casual grin, but my mind was racing that night. I lay awake in bed, replaying every moment, every look, every word that had passed between us. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just overthinking it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something I couldn't control or explain. The next morning, Lucas decided to head into town to pick up a few supplies. He asked if I wanted to join, but part of me knew I needed a moment to clear my head. And perhaps if I was honest with myself, I wanted to be alone with her to see if that connection was real, or just a figment of my imagination. As Lucas drove off, I lingered in the cabin trying to act casual. Mrs. Grant was in the kitchen, humming softly as she cleaned up the dishes. The silence was thick, filled with an unspoken tension that made the air feel heavy. "So did you enjoy the hike?" she asked, breaking the quiet. "Yeah, it was amazing," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "This place really is something else." She nodded her eyes, flickering to me with that same intensity. "I'm glad it's always been a special place for us, for me." Her voice softened, and there was a vulnerability there that caught me off guard. Being out here, away from everything, it makes you think differently, see things differently. Don't you think I swallowed, feeling the weight of her words? "Yeah. I get what you mean." Our eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The distance between us felt like a fragile thread, one that could break or draw us closer with just a word. And then, almost as if she'd read my mind, she took a step forward, her expression cautious, hesitant. "I hope I'm not making you uncomfortable," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. "No," I replied, my heart pounding. "Not at all." A silence fell thick and loaded, and I felt the pull between us grow stronger. It was as if we were standing on the edge of something, a line we both knew shouldn't be crossed, and yet neither of us moved to step back. The tension was electric, hanging in the air like a spark, waiting to ignite. And then, just as suddenly, she looked away, taking a steadying breath. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's just this place brings back memories. Sometimes it feels like I'm looking for something that's already gone." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a pang of something close to empathy. She was lonely, haunted by memories that seemed to linger in every corner of this place. And though I knew it was dangerous, though every logical part of me screamed to step back, I found myself moving closer. We sat in silence for a while, side by side, neither of us daring to break the quiet. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, a soft, soothing sound that only heightened the intensity between us. I felt her gaze on me, felt the tension between us grow with every passing second, and then in the stillness she reached over, her hand brushing against mine. It was subtle, a light touch, but it sent a shock through me, a warmth that spread from my fingertips all the way to my chest. I looked up, meeting her gaze, and in that moment I knew there was no turning back. "Maybe we should get some fresh air," she suggested, her voice unsteady. I nodded, barely able to breathe, and together we stepped outside the cool breeze, a welcome contrast to the heat that simmered between us. We walked in silence, side by side, our footsteps crunching on the forest floor. It was as if the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us caught in a current neither of us fully understood. Finally, she stopped turning to face me, her expression unreadable. "You're different than I expected," she said softly, her eyes arching mine. "I didn't think I'd feel this way." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The tension, the anticipation was almost too much, and for a moment we simply stood there, caught in a silence that felt louder than any words could ever be. But there was no escaping it. Now the line had been crossed, and as we stood there in the fading light, I realized that this connection, this pull, was something neither of us could ignore. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before something would have to give. I thought I understood boundaries. I thought I knew where the line was drawn, clear and unbreakable. But out here, with just the two of us in this vast, isolated wilderness, it felt like every line had started to blur. That evening, Lucas was still out, having met up with an old friend in town, leaving Mrs. Grant and me alone at the cabin. The air was filled with an unspoken anticipation, a charge that seemed to grow with every shared glance, every fleeting touch. We were on the porch, the last glow of the sun, casting shadows across the trees, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She sat across from me, her face softened by the dimming light, and for a long time neither of us said a word. It was as if the silence itself was speaking, carrying the weight of everything unspoken between us. She broke the quiet first, her voice a soft murmur. "It's funny. I didn't expect this trip to be anything out of the ordinary, just Lucas bringing a friend up to relax." But her words trailed off, and she looked down, a faint smile, tugging at her lips. "But here we are," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know why, but it felt right to say it somehow. Acknowledging the tension between us made it feel real tangible. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and there was something vulnerable there, something that pulled me in. "Yes," she murmured, her gaze intense. "Here we are." The moment stretched out, the air thick with anticipation. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat louder than the last. And though every logical part of me warned to step back, I found myself moving closer instead. She didn't move away. If anything, she leaned in, her eyes, never leaving mine. I couldn't tell who moved first. Maybe it was me, maybe her. But suddenly the space between us closed, and I felt the soft warmth of her lips against mine. It was gentle, tentative, as if testing the waters, but it sent a shiver down my spine, a thrill that made my pulse race. Her hand found mine, fingers intertwining, and for a moment the rest of the world melted away. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release, a letting go of everything we'd been holding back. Her hand slid up to my shoulders, her touch light and warm, and I found myself wrapping my arms around her, pulling her closer. The connection between us was undeniable, something that had been building, growing from the first glance we'd shared in the cabin. She pulled back slightly, her gaze searching as if looking for reassurance. "I don't know if we should," she murmured, her voice trembling. But even as she spoke, her hand tightened around mine, unwilling to let go. I held her gaze, my own feelings, a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "Maybe we shouldn't, but it feels right. Being here with you." She let out a soft, almost defeated sigh, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's been a long time since I felt this way." She admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words lingered in the air, and for a moment we just looked at each other, caught in the closeness of that confession. Without thinking, I leaned in again, brushing my lips against hers, this time with more certainty. She responded immediately, her hand slipping around my neck, pulling me in as the kiss deepened, growing with a passion that surprised us both. It was as if we'd been holding back for so long that now that the walls were down, there was no stopping it. We broke apart only when we needed air, her forehead resting against mine. As we caught our breath, she looked at me, a mix of wonder and fear in her eyes. "I don't know where this is going," she whispered, her fingers tracing light circles on my shoulder. "But right now I don't want to stop." I didn't have an answer for her, but in that moment, words felt unnecessary. There was something raw, something real about what was happening, and I didn't want to question it. I didn't want to let doubt ruin what felt so right. "Come inside," she whispered, her voice, soft but firm and without hesitation. I followed her back into the cabin. The quiet inside was different, almost reverent, and every movement felt charged. Heavy with meaning, she led me to the living room where the fire had died, down to a soft glow casting flickering shadows across the room. We sat together on the couch, the silence between us comfortable, filled with a warmth that went beyond words. Her hand found mine again, her fingers brushing against my skin in a way that sent shivers up my spine. And then she looked at me, her eyes filled with a tenderness that caught me off guard. "This is new." She murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper, but it feels like something I needed. I nodded, unable to tear my gaze away from her. "I feel the same way." I didn't know how to explain it, but something about being with her here in this place felt right in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. She leaned in her lips, whispering against mine, tender and vulnerable. The world dissolved, leaving only us suspended. In a fragile, precious moment, her hands cradled my face, warm and gentle. I felt my heart melt, my soul soar. Time stood still as our breaths entwined, our hands intertwined in this quiet sanctuary. I knew our connection was real, unbreakable. As she rested her head on my shoulder, a soft sigh escaped her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, for being my refuge, my everything. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her closer. "No, thank you. I don't think I realized how much I needed this until now." The minutes slipped by, the only sound, the crackling of the dying fire, and I felt a peace settle over me that I hadn't known I was missing with her beside me. The world felt complete, as if every piece had fallen into place. But even as we sat there, lost in the warmth of each other's presence, I couldn't shake a nagging thought in the back of my mind, the reality of our situation, the fact that this fragile connection was bound to face challenges we couldn't yet foresee. Lucas would return soon, and the outside world would inevitably intrude on this delicate bubble we'd created. She seemed to sense my hesitation, lifting her head to meet my gaze. Her eyes held a question, a silent understanding that this moment, however perfect, was fragile. She gave me a soft, bittersweet smile, one that hinted at the unspoken understanding we shared whatever happens. "Let's not regret this," she murmured, her fingers brushing against my cheek. I nodded, my heart heavy, but filled with a quiet resolve. "I won't this is real," and with that she leaned in, pressing her lips to mine once more, sealing the promise in a kiss that held all the emotions we couldn't put into words. It was a vow, a silent agreement that no matter what came next, we wouldn't let fear ruin what we'd found. The night passed in a blur, each moment with her feeling like a stolen piece of happiness, a fragment of a dream that was too beautiful to last. And as dawn began to break over the mountains, casting a soft glow across the room, we both knew that reality would come crashing in soon enough. But for now, in the quiet, with her head resting on my shoulder and my hand entwined with hers, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. And though we both knew this moment couldn't last, we held on to it, savoring every second, every touch, as if it were the only thing keeping us anchored in the here and now. As dawn crept into the cabin, the soft glow filtering through the windows reminded me that our peaceful bubble was about to burst, the warmth of her beside me, her head resting gently on my shoulder, felt grounding, as if holding on to her could somehow slow down the arrival of the real world. But outside, the sun was rising, casting light over everything hidden in the dark, and with it came the reminder of all the complications we'd managed to keep. At bay, she stirred, lifting her head, and for a moment her expression mirrored my own, a mix of serenity and sadness. "We don't get many moments like this, do we?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I took her hand, squeezing it gently. "No, we don't, but that's what makes them worth holding on to." There was nothing left to say that could capture everything in my head. Every thought and feeling this night had stirred. We'd found something rare here, something that had no easy answers, and as much as I wanted to stay, I knew that in a few hours Lucas would return and everything would shift. We shared a silent understanding as she stood, adjusting her hair and smoothing her clothes. I couldn't help but watch her the morning light, softening her features, making her look almost ethereal. She looked back at me, her eyes saying all the things. Neither of us dared to speak out loud. It was as if in this moment we both understood what would come next, even if we didn't want to accept it. After she left the room, I lingered there for a moment, allowing myself to take in the reality of the situation. I didn't have regrets, but there was a heaviness in my chest that told me things couldn't go back to how they'd been. The simple, carefree weekend I'd expected had turned into something far more complicated, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd have to face the consequences. A few hours later, Lucas returned his usual loud and cheerful self, filling the cabin with energy and excitement. I put on my best casual front, laughing along with his stories and trying to match his enthusiasm. But every time I glanced at Mrs. Grant, I felt that same pull, a magnetic connection that lingered despite our silent agreement to keep our distance. She too was trying her best to act normal, but there were fleeting moments, small glances, brief smiles that hinted at the depth of what lay beneath the surface. As the day wore on, I found myself caught in a strange limbo. Part of me wanted to confront everything head-on to bring the unspoken into the open, but another part wanted to keep it buried to let it remain our shared secret. A moment locked in time that no one else would ever understand. The risk of saying too much felt too great, yet silence felt equally suffocating. In the evening, as Lucas chatted away in the living room, Mrs. Grant caught my eye from across the room. There was something in her gaze, a sense of urgency that seemed to cut through the air between us. She excused herself to the kitchen, and after a moment's hesitation, I followed, hoping Lucas wouldn't notice in the kitchen. The quiet felt charged, and she looked at me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "I don't know what happens next." She began, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "But whatever it is, I want you to know that this meant something to me." I nodded, searching for the right words. It meant something to me too, more than I can even explain. For a moment we simply stood there, the weight of our shared experience. Hanging in the air, she reached out her hand, brushing mine, a brief touch that held more than words ever could. "Maybe it's best if we keep this as it is," she whispered almost to herself. A beautiful moment, untouched by anything outside of this place. I swallowed, feeling a pang of something close to loss, but I knew she was right. This was something precious, something that didn't need the complications of explanations or justifications. It was ours, a fleeting connection that wouldn't fit in the everyday reality, waiting for us. "I won't forget it," I assured her, my voice barely above a whisper. "I won't forget any of this." A small, bittersweet smile crossed her lips, and with one last lingering glance, she turned and walked back into the living room, leaving me standing alone with a mix of emotions I could barely process. I followed a few moments later, joining Lucas as he talked about plans for the next day, trying to focus on his words and ignore the ache in my chest. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. It felt surreal, like a dream that had come and gone too quickly. But every detail was vivid, every moment etched into my memory as if it were carved in stone. I knew that in the morning we'd pack up and return to our everyday lives, and this would become something I'd carry with me in silence. The drive back was quiet, with Lucas chattering about his plans for the rest of the semester, completely unaware of the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Mrs. Grant had given me a warm but brief goodbye, her gaze lingering just a moment too long before she turned and walked back into the cabin. I watched her disappear into the distance, feeling a pang of loss that I hadn't anticipated. As we pulled back onto the main road, I tried to push everything to the back of my mind, focusing on the familiar landmarks passing by the winding roads, the mountains fading into the distance. But her image stayed with me as vivid and real as if she were still sitting beside me. Lucas, oblivious to everything, kept talking, his words washing over me as I nodded along, half listening, and in those quiet moments I found myself coming to terms with everything that had happened. I knew that this was something I'd carry with me, a memory that would stay alive in the quiet spaces of my mind, a reminder of a connection that had been both unexpected and unforgettable. When we arrived back on campus, everything felt different. The familiar surroundings seemed somehow distant, as if I'd left part of myself back in that cabin, along with the memories we'd made. Lucas slapped me on the back, grinning as he talked about plans to do it all over again next year, completely unaware of the reality that I couldn't go back to that place without being reminded of her, of everything we'd shared. As the days turned into weeks, the memories softened, settling into a quiet corner of my mind. Life moved on, filled with exams, projects, and the everyday rhythm of college. But in the still moments, when everything was quiet, I'd find myself thinking back, remembering her smile, her laughter, the way she'd looked at me in the soft morning light. And in those moments, I knew that I'd been changed, that some part of me had been forever marked by that weekend. It was a memory I'd keep close, a story that would remain mine alone. There was no need to share it, no need to explain it to anyone. It was a chapter that didn't require an ending, a piece of my life that I'd carry forward, a reminder of a time when I'd felt something rare and real. And as I looked out at the world around me, I felt a quiet sense of peace. Life had moved on, but that moment, that weekend in the mountains would always be with me, a part of who I was. And though it was over, though it had ended as quickly as it had begun, it was something I'd never forget. It was a memory that would linger, silent and untouched, a reminder of a connection that had been as brief as it was beautiful.